Okay, so here we are again, the Flânuers podcast. Welcome back, everybody, and I'm super excited this week because I've got an old pal. You'll see her here, Angela. Ange we met on my first ever freelance gig at what we call over here in the UK Red Brick University, one of the best red brick universities going. Has a place very close to Angela's heart, place in my heart as well. And it's renowned for an absolute breaker of new technology, innovation. First stored computer program came from this place, where Turing pioneered artificial intelligence, gave us the Hubble telescope. Arthur Lewis, the economist, became the first black British professor there. And Christopher Pankhurst graduated law, and graphene was invented there. And I met Angela, or Ange as I call her, so I'll be calling her Ange from now on. And so it's lovely. And Ange was one of the people who, when the three of us got together and said, why don't we record our conversations and put them out for other people to eavesdrop on? And I posted that on LinkedIn, and Ange was one of the first people to get back and say, this sounds good. It was lovely and encouraging, and said you'd want to come along and chat with us as well. So, and that's happened now. So, so this is lovely. So, Ange, if you'd like to give us and our listener a quick intro to who you are and what you do, that'd be great.
Cool. Cheers, Matt. So as Matt said, we met some time ago, some years ago, and neither of us can ever really remember how many years ago that was, but it feels like it was both a million years ago and sort of a couple of years ago.
It's a
Uh,
decade. It's a decade because it's a
yeah,
decade since I started freelancing. So there you
that
go. We've got something to
full on.
celebrate.
Yeah, and I kind of it was Matt flipped my career around, I think, which sounds kind of quite grand, but I was very definitely set in a track as a ITIL service delivery manager, and then this redhead bloke came along and started talking about this crazy agile stuff that the cool kids were doing. And 10 years later, as it turns out, I've been in product and product management for the vast majority of that time since I met Matt. Reason to the point where I've recently gone freelance as well. I think I'm just over a year freelancing now and absolutely loving it. And Matt will probably say, I told you so, because he
Yeah,
did 10 years ago. And then I finally did it. And here I am.
brilliant. Well, it's lovely to have you on. And so when
Welcome.
you got
Glad
back
to
to
have
me
you.
on that LinkedIn, you said there was something you might want to talk about. Do you want to tell us what that is?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if it comes from a place of oh, I must inform the world about this thing, or whether I just want to have a good grumble with some people who might be able to, help me figure through a few things. But in the world of agile, and particularly in the UK government, we do a lot of discovery, so product discovery. But what do you do when the discovery is about discovery? Like, do you know what I mean? It's that kind
Sounds
of,
meta.
yeah. And you can go into a spiral with yourself, kind of, what is this? What are we doing? And you keep trying to come back to what's the value? What's the problem? It's like, well, I don't know because we've not thought about it. So yeah, that's my topic. But that just probably doesn't do the topic justice because there's kind of a
Yeah.
lot that I could unpack in that.
Can you elaborate more about what is discovery about discovery? What does that mean?
I think so. So particularly at the moment, I'm grappling with this thing. So it's an organization who's going through a huge digital transformation. One of the, because I think there's, if you've been around for a while, you kind of get into this mindset that everyone must have transformed into agile already, and then you realize that actually that's not true. And there's still tons and tons of folks out there still, thinking about how they make that first step. And they want to introduce agile ways of working, and they particularly want to hang off. So it's government digital standards, GDS standards, that we have here in the UK, and it's five very distinct phases of this discovery. There's alpha, there's beta, Well, there's public beta, private beta, public beta, live, and then sunset. So it's this very rigid way of doing things, and it's very, very good. Love it to bits. So this organization at the moment is like they want to do that, but they still have all this old stuff, and they want to do a discovery, but where did they start? So the discovery is about what do we do a discovery on, and it's partially blowing my mind because it's like, well, because normally you kind of, you rock up and they're like, we've got this problem we need to fix, and it's like, great, it might be complicated and there might be some ambiguity around it, but ultimately someone's told you what the problem is. But this is just the problem is we're not agile, and that's the starting point.
It's an interesting relationship with certainty as well, isn't it? I think it feels like what you just said there. It's like, so like discovery might be where you start to understand what you could tackle, or try and uncover I suppose in a private organization would be in the marketplace, or in a public institution, it's more about in society. But it's about discovering what would be valuable to that society or that marketplace, because that's not certain either, is it? And it's the thing like that we think like, well, we can determine before we go and do that where we should, I don't know, where we should cast the rod.
Yes.
And that's going to be very precise. It's like, ugh.
Yeah.
So
the hypothesis, isn't it? It's all an unknown, isn't it? I suppose.
So just to make sure I'm understanding, when you say discovery, it's about what problem we're trying to solve first, where we're gonna start.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it, and that's almost the first part of the discovery about discovery, because then the next thing will be, it's I'm partly wanted to talk about it today because I'm struggling to articulate and to unpack what this thing is, this task ahead, because it feels enormous at the moment. It just feels like you're stood at the bottom of a huge mountain that you can't even see the top of, let alone a path,
So does it also include discovery about how we do discovery? Is that part of is that in there as well?
Yeah, on this particular example, it is, because there's a new way of working and kind of introducing this new way of doing things to an organization. And there's the multifaceted thing of that is that the team themselves haven't worked in this way. The organization hasn't worked in this way. So they kind of like, we want a thing. We just want it. We don't want to talk to you in between here and now and then, just make the thing happen. So it's kind of that. And that I'm more comfortable doing that, because that feels like something that I've been doing for the last 10 years. It's kind of getting people to work in that more iterative way, which is all it comes down to in my head. But I think with that, at the moment, it's like, well, we're going to do this thing in this way. And they're like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, okay, well, we have to go away and think about that. And it's,
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's like giving people confidence, isn't it? That because those people you gather, the thing about civil servants, and I mostly only know civil servants in the UK, but I can imagine in France, in Cameroon,
in Senegal,
Senegal. I always forget. Senegal, where Sanjay, your family are, and in the States. I mean, civil servants are probably very similar animals, aren't they? They give to, well, yeah, but I mean, essentially, you can have varying degrees and everyone's different, but I mean, they're there to do stuff. They might be assigned to a ministry or a domain or whatever, but they do, I think, intently and intensely get to understand their service users. And I think what's quite interesting is like when you put this different construct in front of them of like, well, we're going to do discovery now. Confidence can drain out of them like, okay, tell me what I'm supposed to do. It's like, well, actually, what we want to do through this process is get out of you what you know about just the stuff, because you're like you are, this is ingrained in you. You have a lot of tacit knowledge. If we don't get citizens or the people who live in this community into this room, then you are a good proxy because you've worked with them time and time again. And I think getting that confidence up for that first few goes is something that can probably alleviate the situation. But again, like I always say, I'm not much of a product person, so just down in Nigeria, a bit more.
I know. I'd say even companies who, so I have a recent example of a client who comes from a product background, right? Coming from another industry, he's moved over to another industry, and he's bringing in that sort of product speak, product baggage, product culture. But they're having the toughest time figuring out what discovery is. Where do we start what discovery is? How do we slice up the things that are worth discovering and slice them up into digestible pieces of discovery that make sense, that are short enough that we can really iterate? And then, so the first thing is just, aligning everyone around just the language and just what discovery really means, right? So I think that's symptomatic to a bunch of organizations. And I think the second thing is ownership. I think, especially in government cultures, I think they have much contact, but with the very few instances I've had contact, I think ownership plays such an important role in the very life cycle of how things happen, because you're given a task or a project or something to carry out, and you're expected to carry it out in a very definitive time frame. And sometimes in the critical path of that time frame that you're supposed to discover or do that bit of piece or project or whatever, you may be relying upon others and their knowledge and their time to help unpack and discover things that you have questions about before even making certain hypotheses. And I think that in itself is a clear barrier, right, to adopting this new culture where, when you start using things like collective intelligence, it's like, hey, hold your horses there. How do we translate that into my time? What impact that has on these other things that I have to deliver as well. These other people that I have to include in meetings. And so, yeah, that flexibility, just finding that flexibility is tough, and so I'll finish with just this piece. One of the clear indicators I love to use is time to basically to buy in or sign off. So essentially, if I ask you for a meeting, right? If I need this specific group of stakeholders for a meeting, how long does it take for them to even respond to that and even commit and then have that meeting? So that has a huge impact on discovery, because if I need to do this thing for the next quarter, right? But this meeting or these group of people that I need to sign off to understand or whatever are giving me like a month's time before they give me the feedback to even participate in me, that has a huge, it plays a huge significant, sort of, I guess, impact on how I run my discovery, who I involved, et cetera. So I don't know if that resonates with you guys.
It absolutely resonates, yeah, and in some ways, that whole discovery process in UK government or organisations that have adopted the UK government way of doing things, it's kind of easier, but also not. So I kind of rewind on that a little bit. So GDS, Government Digital Services, about 10 years ago, or just over 10 years ago, set out the service standards. So it's a set of standards to which each and every thing that exists in the government space has to meet. Otherwise, it doesn't can't go forward as a service or a product or anything. And it's much loved, quite rightly. It's was a game changer in terms of government websites and government services, and it's been adopted across the globe by I know Canada are strong users, New Zealand, Australia. I believe it's kind of in some parts of the civil service in the US as well, I think. Don't hold me to that one. And part of the idea behind that was that it's and the discovery there has almost got more clarity in a way, because it's, I always describe like to new teams that is there a problem? Can we fix it? Yes or no. And is there a problem is, can we find a user problem? Is there do users have a problem? Yes or no? And if they do, is it technically possible to fix it? And is it financially possible to fix it? Because it has to be done within the confines of the public purse. So you've kind of got a very specific remit that in which it's not like, my fantasy of private companies is that they can experiment. You can play around with a new thing. Google are quite famously do that. They can throw some money into stuff. Will this thing that's a bit like Twitter work? No, it doesn't. What was it called? It was called BuzzFeed or something, wasn't it? All those years ago, didn't work, but that was okay. They could do that. Government's not like that. Government has to account for every penny that it spends. But yet,
I think a company should be accounting for every penny they spend, right? And they should be thinking about desirability, feasibility, and viability when they build stuff, whether you're public sector or not. I think that's part of product. And what's interesting to me is that, so I have some friends that right now are working at a government agency, a Department of Transportation somewhere here in the States. And they have people who are like, well, customers, we don't like, who are customers basically? Like, we don't think about customers, in part because you have elected officials who, right, they get elected and they have a mandate and they want their things done. It's very similar to, I have a CEO who's come in and I want my stuff done. Or head of product comes in and says, I want my things done. And so they dictate what gets done.
All the time.
And so how they're operating is
they're... Say that again, Dan, because you froze.
Oh, my goodness. I hate it when this happens. I have the audio on my end. Yeah. But I'm just saying, when these big name people come in, the CEO or the head of product, and they just want their stuff done, I see similarities between business and public sector, where people come in, whether they're elected or they're put into these positions and hired into these head positions, they just want their stuff done. And so this idea of discovery, well, like, where does discovery come in if I'm just being told to go build the thing? And one thing I wanted to focus on and kind of maybe reorient some of the conversation, because I'm interested in Ange and your take. So, Jeff Patton, a friend of mine, love his course. I talk about him a lot because I think that his product stuff is great and it's accessible, and the way he teaches it is just so, people just, it resonates with people. But I have a visual up from his class and I'll put it up on the screen in post for folks. But for you all, like, he starts in sense. And so it goes in a circle, and he calls it the continuous tech product improvement cycle. And you have sense, focus, discovery, delivery as 4 separate things. It says in reality, a product team is always in all 4, should be in all 4 of those quadrants. It's not like you go from sense to focus to discovery to delivery. You're constantly doing sensing, focusing to make sure you're focusing on the right thing, doing discovery on what you focus on, and then delivering. And so I'm curious about that and kind of how you see that and this notion of a dual track delivery. Like, how do you see that, Ange?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because that's a conversation I've had just this week, or a conversation that's a bit like that this week, in that because at the moment the client that I'm working with, they have a thing already. It's a big website. They've got a thing already. So people are like, folks are kind of concerned that, how can we do discovery? There's something there already. And exactly what you're saying there, I see that as that continual thing that you're just always doing. So if there's a new, if you're going to move something, do like a mini discovery. Discovery, one of the problems with the GDS standards is it says that a discovery is 8 to 12 weeks. So then people try and make it 8 to 12 weeks. And it's like, well, it was a guide. It wasn't you must do it for 8 weeks. You might have enough information to do that in, I'll say an hour to be ridiculous, but it can be anything. So long as you have gone out and found that information and spoken to the subject matter experts and spoken to the users, and kind of, product's all about getting your ducks in a row, isn't it? It's all about kind of, are all these things there? If they're not there, do we need to go and look for them? If we can't find them, they're clearly not a thing, So yeah, to get back to your point, I see that as a you can that to keep. I don't even see it as different things. So I'm not. And I get the concept of dual track, but I think I just see it as one track, but that's
Yeah.
constantly turning.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting to me is that when you have something that exists, I find discoveries easier because so Matt and I did some work together at, I'll say the company name, at Airbnb, and they I think this is complimentary to them, is that they are very strong when it comes to like A/B testing. My goodness, the tooling that they have in place and the sort of the rigor that they put behind A/B testing is pretty impressive. Like I was pretty impressed by what they did, and they can do that because they have a thing. If you don't have a thing, especially not a digital thing, how do you A/B test or how do you do discovery when you don't have a tangible thing? You're left to other devices. Now, there's ways to do it, obviously, right? But it's so much easier when I've got a website and I want to do an addition. Well, I've already got users. I've got people hitting it. I have all that data. I can actually run experiments in relatively like no time at all and gather all sorts of information.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting, that A/B testing. I live for the day when I might work in an organization that has swanky A/B testing tooling, because it is incredibly difficult to do and to do well. And I think one of the problems with the whole life cycle is that people think, gosh, you've done a bit of A/B prototype testing, that you've done A/B testing. It's like you've not. You've tested a fakie, and that's great and lovely. And we got some information that users generally prefer B over A, but there is nothing like getting out in the wild, is there? And getting widening that net and getting more people testing it.
Matt, you were going to say you were jumping in earlier. I think you had a.
Yeah, I can't even remember what I was going to say, but I think what I find interesting about the difference between private and public sector is this, and we did talk about this on a previous episode actually. It's like this thing about failure, isn't it? It's like we in office politics, failure can put the fear of God into people. In party politics, or the politics of a country, it just can be very risky, can't it? And so, one of the things about discovery is it's as much as discovering what you should be doing as filtering out what you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, I think, for people to say we've spent some time and we've discovered these things we shouldn't be doing. So therefore, we've refined where we're going to go. But at any given moment, if you're free and easy with that information, someone could say, like, well, hang on, so you've just been wasting your time. And that's a cultural thing. And that can be the sort of thing that really, like, no matter what, and I completely agree with Dan, but no matter what tooling you get, actually, you only really get tooling out of the fact that you've created a culture where people want to do this. So you go, right, here's some tooling where you can just do it. You can do it, all the time. You can get really, really good at it. But if you don't have that, which clearly the organization that Dan and I work with, they had that culture. They were about, let's go and discover where the value is by understanding where it isn't. But if you haven't got a culture, if your culture is a bit like, we can't be seen to be being wasteful. Therefore, before we even set foot out the door, we need to know where we're going.
Yeah.
Which is debilitating, isn't it? You can't
start a line. Yeah. I found it very interesting that I haven't heard enough. Maybe I haven't looked in the right places. But speaking to everything you guys have touched on, I thought COVID was the best experiment, especially in the government space, dealing with discovery and this whole notion of uncertainty and I think when you talked about sense, focus, discover, deliver, those are your interweaving phases, right? And you're constantly navigating because you're very seldom working on just one thing. You're oftentimes working in multi task switching and multiple different things at the same time. That's an economic thing that we haven't quite figured out yet. But I feel like there's an intangible cost to creating the type of space where you can really do true discovery and really challenge your thinking, challenge the hypotheses you're making before you signed off on these projects or your mandate, right? And so that's why I love that quote in the Eric Nieberg Product Ownership in a Nutshell, which is now legendary, right? And it says, if you don't like transparency, you won't like Agile, because Agile uncovers all the things that, impede you from, challenging your hypotheses, from challenging your truths, challenging your convictions, challenging your mandate. And so if you're not okay with that, with that's transparency and having the courage to highlight them, then yeah, in government politics, for example, yeah, you're going to lose your seat at the next legislative elections, or you're going to get people running in circles around you, like, Prime Minister Sunak is right now, in a very difficult state. And so I feel like the cost of that transparency in politics touches at the very sort of human ethos of what politics is about, right? And so how do you scratch my back and I scratch yours? We both kind of win while giving whatever promise it is to the people who elected us, right? And that's sometimes very costly. It takes but I do feel like it's an ingredient that sort of taps into all of that sort of cultural yuck, or mess that's in politics, and that's very disruptive and destructive in politics, because at the end of the day, it's about who the users are, who the people are, who the citizens who are going to be benefiting from these services, and those are the people we last think of when we have these very hard-grained hypotheses around what we want to discover and how they should materialize. So yeah, what's the cost of transparency in these in government? How do you address that?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably $1 million question, literally. It's kind of, I've been talking a lot about, and I don't, in my head, they've kind of joined up, and I'm not quite sure why, but I've been talking about the cost of failing slowly, and that kind of, chugging on with something for the sake of doing it. How do you, because my big worry about the thing that I'm doing at the moment is that you kind of settle on something to do, to take forward to discovery, and then it turns out that it's the wrong thing, which isn't, there can't be a wrong thing in discovery, because that's what you're trying to discover. But when the expectation has become that you go smoothly from discovery to alpha to beta without taking a breath in between, then that's when you start to fail slowly, and that was very, very costly, very, very costly. Yeah.
Two things. I think one. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, so just a quick one, but like in discovery, how does the group who you gather around the discovery, how do they, warn? How are the means of them saying, like, we're going the wrong way, like, turn the bus around or take a different route? Do that, and if they have that means, do they feel comfortable sort of showing up? Because like you just said, that slow descent into, oh, we're just going this way anyway now, and everyone's just looking out the windows of the bus.
Yeah, I mean that's really hard, isn't it? Because you were talking about those kind of CEOs that have those grandiose ideas that come along, and you start demanding things. You do very much have the same thing in the civil service, in government. You have very senior people saying, I want AI, that I want AI on this government department site. And then it's, because I'm, became a little bit, I worked for a really large, as a civil servant in one of in probably the biggest department. And I got a bit of a reputation for putting discoveries in the bin, because, I didn't shy away from saying, this isn't worth doing. Like, we shouldn't be doing this. It's going to cost too much money. There's a thing over there that does 95% of it. So we can't fiscally say that this is the correct thing to do. But that, I don't know if that did my career any good in the civil service, because nobody wants to hear that. No one wants to hear that that's the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And that's where that kind of, sticking to the 8 weeks kind of comes from. Like we knew that in 4 weeks. Like we did
Mhm.
spoke to a few people, we knew it in 4 weeks, could have binned it then, but we ploughed on, kept trying to look for evidence that it was a thing to do when it wasn't. It just simply wasn't a thing to do.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we're coming up to 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I'll use what I was going to say. I'll use in my minute to wrap up. So one, I think, is this idea of a smooth transition between I think that's why you're living in all four of these sectors that Jeff talks about all at once, right? Is because it isn't smooth. You don't go straight from one to the next, and deliver. There's some checking and some stopping things, and so if you don't have you can't get to a continuous flow of work. Getting into things that Matt likes to talk about, flow. If the flow stops because you've stopped something and you don't have anything coming in down the pipeline, well, then all the work stops. So you have to be in all the areas so you have a continuous flow of work to do. And the other is that when you talk about what not to do, I think that's so critical. And there's this great book, I think it's 10x is easier than 2x, and it's essentially talking about the Pareto rule, that the 80-20 rule, that if you focus on the 20% of stuff that you do really well and you just stop doing the 80% of stuff, you can 10x your results, essentially that. And just a quick story on that, I think there are some drawbacks to that too. I was just talking to my mom yesterday, and we're talking about cakes. She's gotten to the age, she doesn't like baking cakes anymore. She just likes to buy birthday cakes. But she likes, powdered sugar, buttercream frosting like she used to make, and there's actually a place in San Diego that does that, but very expensive. It's like a cake costs you like $70, maybe $100. It's ridiculous. So she used to be able to get it at Whole Foods, and she's like, they stopped making them. And to her, what she suspects is that Amazon got a hold of Whole Foods, and they came in with their big data, and they said, not enough people buy that cake. These are our best sellers. Stop making those. Only make those. And here's my mom an alert saying, but now I can't get the cake that I want, right? The cake that I liked, I can't get because they've optimized. Anyway, sorry, I went way over my minute, but there you go. Thoughts on that stuff?
We always have space for mom stories, so.
Yeah, it feels like there's a niche market that we could all get into in San Diego there.
Sanjay, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I can go next. It like I said, this really strikes a chord with me, and I think there's things that we over time have done, I think, in this sort of agile revolution that I think in terms of, we always talk about patterns and anti-patterns. And I think if we just look at the very recent shared global worldwide experiment that we were all forced in, which was COVID, I think there's things there that we were forced to do, and that, in dealing with uncertainty, we're dealing with transparency, dealing with all these things, because at some point, we all had the same burning platform, right? And so, the lack of transparency was actually something that couldn't be tolerable, because lives were at stake and economic factors were at stake. Everything was at stake. And so what did we learn at a very short time span? What were people able to adopt? And what are some of those things that have been adopted like over time and I can still continue? And what are some of those where we've left them, what are some of those practices that we've left, unfortunately, and gone back to what we used to do before? So I think that could be a great talk, I think, for us to sort of explore, what do we exactly learn? And are those things amplified, and around this very topic of creating safety, creating safe space, allowing people to discover, and and the inherent cost of dealing with uncertainty and finding value in that. But yeah,
I think that's made me feel a bit sad for the things that we've not continued from COVID.
Mhm.
That was going to be, I think that was going to be my wrap up, leading on from what Sanjay says, is that also, I mean, in the UK, as we know, Angela, not only did we have COVID, but we've had Brexit, we've had the electorate spoke, and there's been a massive change because of that. I think one of the things for me about, maybe the worry that you have about, and that I've spoken to a lot of people actually about how product discovery happens, and that people don't really use it as a product discovery. It's just another it's a process that, like you're saying, like some lovely people said it should be 6 to 8 weeks. And people hear, mostly what they hear is, do it for 8 weeks. do what? Well, just read the rest of the stuff in the rundown. Whereas really they sort of saying, give yourself that between that and that amount of time. Don't go beyond it, because then you're just navel gazing. You're taking too long for it. You're putting off what you could achieve. But then you think back to like what we did achieve in COVID, like Sanjiri says, what we have achieved through the uncoupling of ourselves from the EU. Like people were doing discoveries through that willy-nilly, left, right, and centre. And it's often under those times of duress when we collaborate more, when we ask for information, we get it, when nothing's too much trouble. It's like, well, we're gonna have to go and ask those people, right? Quick, go and ask those people. Everything sort of speeds up, and like you've just sort of touched on there, it's like, how do you make those times? How do you spill them over into, well, there's no massive urgency right now, but we could still do it. Like maybe this thing is that important. Maybe everyday things are that important. And how do we still do it? And so I think one of the things that, like, going back to how do we get people to do that, is that what's quite nice then, what is the opportunity at the moment, is we can point to those things and go, you have already done this. You're good at it. You're ace. Just do it like we did it 2 years ago or 4 years ago, and try and get them to think like, that they are, like, they've got the courage. They've done it before now. Pretend people are still telling you to get it done yesterday. I don't know, there's things we could maybe pull on, I suppose.
Yeah.
What are your final thoughts, Ange?
Yeah.
I mean, we've definitely zigzagged around this topic, which probably just shows how big it is. I think I came along thinking it's a small topic, and why would we be wasting these folks' time with this tiny topic? And it's not. It is really nuanced. It is really complicated. I feel like I've done about 15 discoveries over the last few years. So I sort of feel like I should know lots and lots about them, but every single one that I do is different. Totally different. You cannot say, which is why lovely things like the GDS service standards, which are fantastic and give you a nice guide, the putting a framework around something is sometimes the worst thing you can do for it, because it then becomes like a speed limit. You put 70 miles an hour, then that becomes the target rather than the maximum is. And I just think we're going through a lot of that, and and I think partly because we've got AI coming down the line as well, and it feels like a juggernaut that we can't stop. It's coming whether we like it or not. My huge fear is that a lot of people are going to bypass that whole true discovery thing, and just implement some kind of AI for no good reason. And also on that COVID thing, I think, listening to what you were saying there, Matt, it's, that old saying of the devil will make work for idle hands.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're at. We've got too much time to think now, without that emergency.
Definitely.
I just want to clarify, when you said speed limit, I thought that was a minimum. That's how I treat it anyway.
You like to stay up with that? Is that like...
No, that's why I have an integrated laser radar detector in my fast car, so that I know when I'm getting hit with those things and I can slow down.
Sounds like
Smokey and the Bandit down your way, is it?
That sounds like a Mike Myers.
Yeah. Although if the cops are listening, it is definitely not a jammer, because jammers are illegal, but it is a radar detector.
But on that bombshell, we should just say stay safe to everyone. Don't go driving where Dan lives. And thank you so much, Ange. It's been brilliant chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks
for joining us. Fun.
Yeah.
And we'll see everybody soon.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us today on Flânuers, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, you know what to do.